There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. And I couldn't be bothered to move some of the stuff out of the way so it wouldn't be in the shot because it's all books. So why would I move it out of view? I have actually had a fantastic reading week. One of the best so far this year. No, well it is, but one of the best in many weeks. 3 5-star reads. Can you breathe? So that I'll get into in a bit. But first, I also had a 5-star biblio adventure on Monday night. I usually work on Monday night, but I rescheduled that class with my Japanese students so that I could go with my mom to this event. The Saskatoon book launch for the Governor General's award-winning work of nonfiction, Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre by Negan Sinclair. Lindy has talked about this quite passionately on her channel, and I wasn't sure if I was, if I needed another on-read work of Indigenous nonfiction on my shelf that I really want to get to, but who knows when I'll get to it. But Negan Sinclair is pretty special. He is the son of Murray Sinclair, and if you're not Canadian, you don't know who he is, but really, he is the one person who uncomfortably lived in what is now known as Canada that you should know about. He just died a few weeks ago, actually. He was the Anishinaabe man who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Committee about the residential schools atrocity that Canada perpetrated on its Indigenous peoples from the late 19th century into the late 20th century. He just had a kind of Nelson Mandela-like calm indignation about him that I just loved, and I consider him to be far more important than anybody else that you might hear being talked about in the news that has anything to do with Canada. And his son is a very accomplished academic, newspaper columnist, activist, writer, editor, and so on. And this is his book about Winnipeg, which is not just the name of the city, Winnipeg, but a Indigenous and environmental history of this part of the world that relates right down to the environmental importance of algae and the web of connection between all of the under the ground and over the ground and through Indigenous lives and the colonialist assholes that have tried to ruin everything. He didn't read from it very much, but he gave us really a lecture with kind of PowerPoint slides and so on, showing certain uncomfortable clashes between colonialist Canada and the Indigenous peoples, and how Indigenous peoples are rising and challenging and reshaping Canada. And it's that last part that was so full of hope and beautiful anger and joy that Mom and I were both in tears by the time he was done. And that's all I could manage to say to Negan Sinclair when I was first in line to get my book autographed. And I said, well, I can't really say anything to you because I might cry. He was just lovely. Mom and I also went with my friend Kathy, and the three of us just thought it was an amazing, once-in-a-lifetime event. I can't wait to read this. All right, without further ado, here is this week's incredibly interesting mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is one of the most literary people I know here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, William Robertson. Some of his bios cite all these hats that he has worn at various points in his illustrious career. Poet, university English instructor, freelance writer, reviewer, and broadcaster, but that list is not complete. Bill, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
It's so great to chat with you. Bill Robertson and I crossed paths at the University of Saskatchewan when I was finishing up my honors English degree, and you were on the faculty at that time. You were maybe teaching creative writing, were you?
I was teaching creative writing over at ITEP at the Indian Teacher Education Program, as well
Okay.
as freshman English and grammar.
And we're going to talk about ITEP a little later because that's fascinating. Yeah, you were just a very friendly guy. I would often stop in the hallway of the English department and chat about this, that, and the other thing. Now I've seen you at just about any reading I go to at McNally Robinson. You're there too. So that's how we've kind of reconnected.
Gotcha.
Tell us about William Robertson, the poet.
Oh dear, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I guess if you measure yourself in publishing, then I've been falling short lately. I was really churning them out there regularly, Sean, once every 5 years, which is not the rate some people see as that, whatever it is, but it worked for me because I had other things on the go, such as teaching, such as reviewing, all those things. But I haven't published a book lately, although I do keep writing. I'm technologically unsound. And those days when I started trying to get poems into magazines and journals, it was back in the early 80s, even the 70s, I guess. And, you used to put your poems into a big envelope with an SASE inside, a self addressed stamped envelope, and fire it off to somebody. And then 6 or 8 or 10 weeks and get a rejection slip back. And you did this until you'd gotten a few acceptances and, eventually were brave enough to approach a publisher with enough poems for a collection. But in the new world, with the online forums for getting your work sent off, I find it's an intimidation factor, Sean. They say, well, just do this and this and this to send you. And I just go, oh, the hell with that. And I don't send anything off, which is kind of pathetic. I still write. I just haven't approached a publisher with a manuscript yet, although a manuscript does exist.
And I think really it's quality, not quantity. I believe you've had at least four poetry collections, maybe more, published.
5.
Five, yeah. And the last one was maybe
Yeah.
2017. So it's not a whole lot longer than 5 years ago. And it's not like you've been sitting, resting on your laurels. You've been involved in all kinds of things. I didn't know until I saw this that you've written a biography of Katie Lang. So when did that come out?
Yeah, that was way back. That bio that you just mentioned, it's the same for a number of people. Margaret McPherson was just in town. She's got one of those.
That's right. It's a series.
Art Slade. It's not necessarily the same publishing company, but it seems as if a lot of us were approached or have been approached in the day to write a slender biography of a famous Canadian. I was approached back in I guess about 91 or so to do a biography of Katie Lang. ECW Press in Montreal asked me. It was a year project, and that was pre-internet. So it was, go to the library and go to their card catalog and find everything that's ever been written about KD. It was very intense. It took a full year of my time.
Did you get a chance to interview Katie Lang?
No, I did not. I did not. Her manager told me in no uncertain terms that she didn't want to have anything to do with anybody like me, a biographer. But he gave me access to a lot of material. And then, true to form, I was pilloried in many book reviews for not interviewing the woman herself. Some reviews were not too kind, but on the other hand, I will say this for myself: they decided to publish it in the United States. ECW worked out a deal with a publisher in the United States. It was published there and sold a pile of copies. And I mention this because my friend Lois Simi happened to be reading the Globe and Mail one day, and there was an article in there that said that ECW Press had been on the financial ropes, but had been saved by the huge amount of sales that this KD Lang book had generated. I was living in Lois's
Yeah.
basement at the time, and didn't really have a job. So I wrote ECW and asked if all this money that they'd made off this book, if they could fire a little my way. And hugely surprising, Sean, but they didn't agree to send any money my way. They
Well,
felt that their contract had been honored, and I'd signed it, and they'd given me the money, and that was it. So
maybe you better update it on better
oh,
contract.
I think someone's already done that. I'll leave it to them.
You were born in Tokyo, and I, of course, my viewers know I lived there for 13 years. Just been back in Saskatoon a couple of years now. You don't look Japanese to me. How did that come to be?
Well, I'm not Japanese at all, although you have tapped into some of the racist comments that my fellow students made to me when the teacher would ask us, there's always that fateful moment when you're in grade 5 or something, and the teacher goes around the room and asks everybody what their birth date is and where they were born. And when I would mention Tokyo, of course, this would bring out the comments from some of the more enlightened folk. But no, my parents are Canadian. They were missionaries, United Church missionaries. They were over there in the early 50s. I was born there in Tokyo, as were my sisters were born in Japan as well.
And how long did you live in Japan?
7 years.
Okay, so the first 7, that's a pretty formative time. What are some of your strongest memories of growing up in Tokyo?
Oh boy. Well, I didn't grow up in Tokyo actually, Sean. I was born there, and then we spirited ourselves off to a mountain city called Matsumoto and lived
Okay.
there for a number of years. And I don't have really vivid memories, to tell you the truth. One of my favorite memories is catching frogs in rice paddies. I love to catch frogs and bring them
And did you
home.
write a haiku about it?
I did not actually. I didn't write a haiku, but I caught a lot of frogs, which is more important for a boy of 4 or 5. And my parents gave me, I don't know if they intended to do this, probably because I had a baby sister at home, but I had a lot of free reign just to wander around. So that's kind of my memory is I remember walking through a meadow full of flowers, and I remember catching frogs. So that's that. And then we lived in a suburb of Tokyo called Hino. I went to a Japanese kindergarten when I was in Matsumoto, but when we lived in Hino, my parents got me into an American Air Base school. So that was a strange cultural thing. I went to Tachikawa Air Force Base. I drove in with people who worked on the base and had 2 sons who were in that school. I drove in with them and went to grade 1 and half of 2, pledging the oath of allegiance and singing, America the Beautiful and things like that. And then we moved to Canada, to a town of 200 people in Ontario, one-room schoolhouse, and the culture shock of suddenly, oh, Canada it was, and a chocolate bar map of Canada on the wall. So
And God save the Queen.
there you go.
You have invested a lot of your time and energy and creativity in teaching creative writing. So I guess you believe that creative writing can be taught.
Well, yeah. I never took a creative writing class, and probably a lot of people will agree it shows, but they didn't have them around when I was coming up through the English department. There were no such things. You went to the writing school down at Capel or something like that through the Writers Guild. But I was working teaching English in the Indian teacher education program in the College of Education. And Oris Morawski, who was the chair of it at the time, who was the head or whatever you want to call him, he said that he thought we should start a creative writing program. And I agreed. I thought that there were a lot of stories that needed to be told, traditions to be honored, and a safe place to write and tell those stories. So we started the creative writing program. I think we had 4 the first year. The cap was 15. We had 9 the next year. And then the next year we had 15. So in that third year, I felt a celebration was in order. So I got those, I'd kept copies of all my students' work. So I picked what I thought were the best poems by the first 4 and the second 9. And we published a little fold over 2-staple anthology. We ran off 500 copies at campus printing, and it was a hit. My goodness, everybody wanted to see this thing, and particularly the students the next year. I gave them out as Christmas presents. Well, the inevitable happened. After a few years of this, the students started to say, well, are you going to do a book for us? So after 8 classes had gone by, I typed out what I thought was the best work of 200 and what was it? I don't know, some crazy amount of students. That was published in 2014 as Where I'm From. And it went really well. It was well reviewed. It was picked up and taught in high schools and university classes. I'm very pleased that it made its way up into northern Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
And so I retired in 2019 from active teaching, and I had a big box in my basement containing another 8 classes worth of work. So I guess this is where some of my time has gone, is that
Absolutely.
I typed up that manuscript. This time I enlisted Mika LaFond, wonderful Cree writer, and a former student of mine, actually. She was in the very first anthology, and she helped me. We published another anthology last year called My Family, My People,
Yeah.
and it's done very well. The fact that it is being taught in classes, in First Nations and Métis classes in Saskatchewan, to me is a huge, huge, wonderful thing. And
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
yeah, I'm just so pleased for ITEP that this has happened, and that the ITEP program continues to move out there. This is something that came out of the ITEP creative writing program. And
And I'd like to put William Robertson's name in that sentence. It didn't just happen. You were very instrumental in making it happen, and that's really incredible. My mom got a copy of Mika LaFond's poetry collection. Is it pronounced nipe wanin? My way back.
yeah, nipe wanin.
Uh, Mika was the interviewer for some other Indigenous writer at a book launch, and mom was really quite taken with her and got her book of poetry and really enjoyed it. So I'll have to look into it myself.
Yeah, Mika went through the MFA program, and that book came out of her MFA thesis project. It was the first bilingual thesis that the MFA program had done, and then it was the first bilingual collection of poetry that Thistledown had done. So bravo, Mika.
Absolutely. What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend?
I read a couple of books of essays recently. One is Guy Vanderhaeghe's Because Someone Asked Me to. I always enjoy reading whatever Guy writes, so that was great. And then I was up at a launch after Guy's for a woman named Robin Pacific, artist
I
and
was at
theater.
both of those too.
Yeah,
Yes.
you were at both. So
Yeah.
I was intrigued enough by Robin Pacific's reading that I bought her book. It's called Skater Girl, as you well know. And I just
Yes.
finished that a little while ago. I really enjoyed that. Those are essays. Speaking of poetry, haha, throughout this last year, I've read Sylvia Legris' wonderful book, here we go, the principle of rapid peering, which I just really, really enjoyed. And I'm reading right now. A friend gave me Michael Ondaatje's new book. It's in hardcover. A Year of Last Things, I think it's called. And then, lest it not be thought that I don't read novels, I do like the odd murder mystery, like a Peter Robinson or something. I read Kate Atkinson's Shrines of Gaiety, which I had a lot of fun with. But
Okay.
Zadie Smith's The Fraud, and also James by, now I hope I get his name right,
Yeah.
front to
Yeah.
back,
Yeah.
Percival
Percival
Everett.
Everett. Yes.
Yeah, James. It's, for those of your listeners who don't know, it's the story from his point of view of Jim, companion of Huckleberry Finn. So all
Absolutely.
those times in Huck Finn, when Huck is off doing some cockamamie thing with the king and the duke or whomever, or with the Shepherdsons and Grangerfords feud, what's Jim doing? Well, Jim is James, a very literate, civilized, intelligent human being, not some beast of burden. It's a fascinating book.
Well, it's
Six.
been up for all kinds of awards, and I've heard nothing but good about it, even from people that didn't necessarily get along with some of Everett's earlier work. So I'm looking forward to getting to it. Here's a question, maybe in closing. How does one read a book of poetry? Do you just sit down and read one poem and then turn the page and read another poem, or one poem a day, or just pick it up whenever you feel like it? How do you read a book of poetry?
Yeah, like some people like to, as they said, dip into it. I think being trained as an academic and then, quite frankly, spending 40 years at the Star Phoenix reviewing books, you can't be handed, say, 4 books of poetry and you're going to review the latest output from Thistledown or Cawteau and dip into them. You just have to sit down. And I always keep a pencil handy. I'm still reading like a grad student. And I make check marks and things in the margin, or underline a word that really moves me, or point an arrow at something that really moves me. And I just start at the start. I read the bibliography page, indeed, and I just keep going. And I just read one after another every day until the book is done. I don't have that gun at my head anymore because, of course, the poor old Star Phoenix is a shadow of its former self and doesn't have a book review section anymore. So we don't cover Saskatchewan writers anymore. So that is gone, which is hugely sad. Hugely
It
sad.
really, really is. It's a crime against humanity. I didn't
Yeah,
realize you
yeah.
wrote
So
reviews for 40 years. That's amazing.
yeah,
You should
yeah,
you
40
should get
years.
them published.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure which publisher would want to risk financial ruin by doing that. But anyway,
This has been really fun and interesting conversation, Bill. Thank you so
huh.
much, and I hope you'll come back someday when your next book comes out, or even before.
All right, all right. I'll get at it right away. Thanks, Sean.
Editing Sean here. It's not really editing Sean, but as I was editing that lovely chat with Bill Robertson, I realized we kind of gave his poetry short shrift, which was not intentional. So I've taken the liberty of looking up one of his poems from his 1991 collection, Adult Language Warning, and this is a very appropriate poem for the middle of January. It's called Midwinter. Please enjoy. Christmas has left me tired as the tree by the back fence, where it waves one piece of tinsel, drops its needles on old snow, pitching through the rutted streets in a car that will never warm up. January is a funhouse ride. The attendant has switched on and abandoned. And I could bring all this dissatisfaction home to you. Or I could tell you how the moon through the trees tonight was a golden dish of branches streaked with snow. In this slow and frozen time, I risk this little gift that may slip and shatter on sudden ice between us. Yes, it's literary people like Bill Robertson that are have also been involved from the settler perspective of bringing Indigenous literary voices into the bookstores, onto the curriculum, and into our lives. So, great deal of respect for that man for all that he's done and is doing. I don't have any videos to tell you about. I have a video that I'm so pleased about, proud of, that is almost finished editing. I've done a whole pile of reading and other good stuff and have been working away on this hour-long video, and it will be coming soon. I'm not going to talk about these books in the order that I finished them. They're all 5-star reads, so that means I love them all. But I'm going to save the Shawniest of the books for the last. It's the one that, of these books that I loved, resonated most deeply with just the kind of person and the kind of reader that I am. So I finished 3 books, which is a big number of books, but I've been reading many of them for a long time. And I've started one. I have finally finished. This was a buddy read that I started in December with Joe Smith, and I poked along to finish it up. Hospital by Sanya Rushdi, translated from the Bengali by Arunava. And he talked about this when he was my mystery guest. I'll put a link to that great mystery chat in the show notes. And I was already aware of the book because it was nominated for the Stella. And I loved this cover, but it was only available from the Australian publisher. But the Australian publisher had a sale, so I could afford to buy it. Even for the price of about a hardcover book, I could buy this softcover and have it shipped to Canada. And I have now finally finished reading it. I loved this book. It's a book that's really hard to talk about. It is a work of autofiction about the author's experience of psychosis as a graduate student, living with her Bengali Australian family in Melbourne, Australia. And it's first-person narrative. What gives this book its power is that you are located in the protagonist's calmly psychotic mind, if I can put it that way. My experience of it was a bit different from others, maybe, from my buddy reader, that I found it such a calming read. It was like floating in water. I just loved the protagonist so much. And for large parts of this, she is so clearly disturbed, and yet there was just something so rich and still about her voice. And she's brilliant. She's a grad student and obviously needs to take a break from her graduate studies. And there are excerpts from her graduate work, and it's quite accessible and really, really fascinating. And it's about language, how language relates to mental health and so on, that were breathtaking in a very different way and added something to the text. I don't think I can say very much more about it than that, because that was really what I got from it. It was just a gorgeously written, often quite confusing, but calmly confusing. Like, it calmed me while it confused me. And I just loved the protagonist, and I loved her critique of the mental health psychiatric establishment and all that stuff. Her family was lovely and were doing their best to help her. She was dealing with paranoia about lots of people around her that sometimes she had to give over to, but other times kind of moved through. And I just thought it was a stunning work of literature. I think that a lot of it went over my head, and it was one of those books that I spent as much time just letting it wash over me. That we love to say that when what we're really saying is a lot of things I didn't quite get, but it really was a bath of a really lovely person rendered in really lovely prose. Thanks in large part, I'm sure, to the translation by Arunava. This was a big hit. I recommend it very highly. You can get it more easily in North America, or maybe even in the West, or outside Australia. It's published by Seagull Books, but apparently their version's full of typos, which happens a little bit too often with books by Seagull Books, I have to say. So I should hasten to add that there were no typos of any kind in this by Giramando Publishing. The other one, which I finished just this morning, and I did it almost exclusively on audio, and the audiobook was wonderful as well, is the thriller, I guess I would call it a literary thriller, Other People's Secrets by Meredith Hambrock. Meredith Hambrock lives in Saskatoon. I have interviewed her about this novel, like as a mystery guest, short chat about this novel and other stuff. And neither she or I, is that the right grammar? Neither she or I were sure that it was going to be a Sean book. The publisher has been marketing it as a mystery, which, I don't want to read a mystery. It's not a mystery. I mean, there's mysterious elements, but it's not a whodunit at all. It's suspenseful. It is thrilling. And the reason that I loved it and gave it 5 stars, it was also really moving at the end. It was a beautiful ending, and it was a character-driven thriller. That's what I would call it. So character work is very important to me, and the protagonist here, Baby, is a bit of a, not lost soul, but she's, if you hear the first 5 things people might tell you about her, you'd think she's a loser, but she's anything but. It's obvious how much Meredith Hambrock loved Baby, and she sure made me love Baby, but she was a dumpster baby found in a dumpster, adopted by a single alcoholic woman, and has spent in her adult life, she's just kind of not drifting because she's staying in one place, but She only works in the summer when this resort on a lake gets enough business, and for the rest of the time she's just kind of bumming around, partying and whatnot. I'm not going to say much more about it. It is a very plot-driven. It's not only character-driven. There's a lot that happens. Absolutely. Oh my God. I'm just not going to get into it now. I'm going to be taping an interview, hopefully in the coming day, the next few days, with Meredith about this. So you'll find out more about it then. This is Meredith's debut, so I can't wait to see how her talents, how her gifts continue to develop. But this was a solid, for somebody who doesn't really read thrillers. I think the last thriller I read was one published in 1950. I didn't read it in the 1950s. I read it maybe 5 or 6 years ago and thought it was wonderful. I can't remember what it's called now. I'll put the GIF up here. It was the one that was made into a movie. It was one of Marilyn Monroe's early movies, so I'll put all that on the screen here. And I thought it was a wonderful thriller. It's probably the only thriller I've ever read, or certainly in the last 50 years. No, not 50 years. Well, almost. Maybe the last 40 years is probably the only thriller I'd read. And I had no desire to read another one, but I had enjoyed that one. And now I've really enjoyed this one. I can't wait to talk more with Meredith about it. Big hit. My third 5-star read is the one that is just completely and utterly a Sean book. The Old Haunts by Allan Radcliffe. I think you've heard me rave about this already. Allan was also a mystery guest. I'll put a link to that chat. And this was just a tender, quiet, character-driven novel about grief and memory and sexuality and shame. Oh, I just loved it so much. The protagonist, Jamie, I think he's about 35 maybe. He's lives in London, but he's from Edinburgh. And in the last 9 months, and he's lost both his parents. So they didn't die at the same time, but within less than a year apart. And his fairly new boyfriend, Alex, goes with him to not only for the funeral of his mom, the most recent death, but also to kind of, I think, sell her place and take care of a few things. And then the boyfriend has taken him to another part of Scotland, near where the boyfriend, Alex, grew up. And they spend a few days in a kind of, it's not a bed and breakfast, but some kind of something like that. And they basically just hang out. And they get to know the lady who owns the property. Her name is Kit, and she's an older woman. And not much else happens, except what happens through the memories of Jamie, of his parents, and so on, and of meeting Alex. Oh, it was just gorgeous. Gasp-worthy sentences, several parts about grief, especially between the protagonist and his dad. That I read this aloud to Mary Jean, and there were a few paragraphs that I really had trouble reading out loud because they were hitting so close to home. If you like quiet, character-driven novels where not a whole lot happens, but what does happen just tugs at your heart, and you love beautiful writing, The Old Haunts is for you, absolutely. And Monday, I interviewed Allan Radcliffe, a full-length interview about The Old Haunts, the day after I finished reading it, so stay tuned for that. So that's what I finished. I told you last week that I would be starting, because I finished The Old Haunts, another book written by one of my mystery guests, reading it to Mary Jean, and we have now about 5 chapters in to This Bright Dust by Nina Berkhout. And this is starting out wonderfully too. So I'm on a roll. My reading week couldn't be any better than it was. This is set in 1939 in the prairies. I guess it's actually Alberta, although Alberta's never named. And the main character is Abel, and he's in his late 20s. He's farming alone. His dad died just a few years before, and his mother died when he was very young. And he is trying to keep the farm going and pretty much on the brink of having to declare bankruptcy or whatever. Like, it's the tail end of the Dust Bowl kind of depression. I didn't think it went that late. I have to do some research because I'm fascinated that it was 1939 and that the conditions of this part of Western Canada were still so dry that there was nothing growing and no possibility to get a crop off, and just saddled with debt because of all that. But it's compelling already, and the neighbors just across the way that he watches he knows them, but he's a bit of a loner, and so he doesn't have much to do with them, at least not so far. There's a grandfather, his adult granddaughter, and her child born presumably out of wedlock that she returned from the city with, who's about 7 or 8. A bit of a love vibration, especially going way back into their childhood between Abel and that daughter, Una. The other part of it that's very political and really fascinatingly interwoven into the story is that the royal visit of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who later was known as the Queen Mum, did a cross-country tour, and Abel's against it because he thinks that money should not be spent on such nonsense when people are almost on the verge of starvation in Western Canada, whereas Una, who he's kind of in love with, I think, thinks it's exactly what's needed to cheer everybody up. And so that is all, like I say, threaded through it, and boy, I'm enjoying this. The writing is gorgeous. Nina Berkhout is a poet, and it's not overly poetic, but it's just some very fine writing and characterization, and I have a feeling that this is also going to be a big hit, and Mary Jean agrees. So there you have it. I'm going to start 2 books. So I finished 3 and I'm starting 2, although one of them doesn't really count, and I'll get to that one at the very end, but I am going to start this biography of Somerset Maugham, Willie, The Life of W. Somerset Maugham by Robert Calder. The reason I'm reading it is Robert Calder has lived for decades and still lives in Saskatoon, and this was a Governor General Award-winning biography. Came out quite a while ago, 1989. Bob Calder used to be is a retired English professor. I didn't ever take a class from him. He's a very close friend of Dave Carpenter's, and so Dave introduced me to him, and I'm going to interview him once I've read the book. I was hoping to make all that happen last year, but it just didn't work out, so I'm now finally starting it, and I'm going to do a full-length interview with Bob Calder once I'm finished. And finally, this is one of those cheats. It's the first time I'm cheating in 2025. I think it's a memoir. Let's see. Yeah, graphic memoir that was recommended to me by one of my mystery guests, Kurti Badressa, just a few weeks ago, and she recommended it to me. I don't remember if she actually recommended it during the mystery guest or chat or after we turned the recorder off. But anyway, I found my library had it. It is called All Our Ordinary Stories, a Multigenerational Family Odyssey. Teresa Wong, I believe she lives in Calgary. Yes, she does. And she has written comics and illustrated essays that have been in the New Yorker and the Walrus. Her first graphic memoir, Dear Scarlet. She's an up-and-coming writer, to put it mildly. This came out in 2024, and I think the subtitle speaks for itself, but let's see, the family is Chinese and then Chinese-Canadian. So my plan is to read it this week. It doesn't matter if I don't quite make it, but the cheat clause in my contract with myself to cut down on my reading about a year ago was if I can read a book from between one Friday reads and the next Friday reads, it doesn't count. Like it does bring my number up, but only for 7 days or 6 days. It doesn't count. So I'm going to hope that that's what this is going to be. But if I find I need more time to read it, I'm going to take it. Dang it all. All right. So that is what I've got to say this week. Thanks for watching.